Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where I want to think more deeply with you about Christian faith and life. Hey, you believers, you non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and all you think I'm a believers, welcome. Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. I'm very happy that you want to think more carefully with me about the afterlife. What did centuries worth of people believe? Why did their beliefs shift? How does that inform our belief and practice today? It's all engaging stuff to a dweeb like me. I guess if you're listening, that means you too have some dweeb in you, huh? Maybe just a drop? So you're a dweeb drop. Well then, welcome to you, all my dweeb drops. But first, we all are going to die. I'm not saying that to ruin your workout. I know some of you listen to me while you're working out. I'm saying that because, as the mid-20th century existentialist philosophers all agreed, death confronts us. Death is in the back of the mind of every person who walks the planet. Death is a stark realization. Death frames our very existence. So then, how we process death, how we deal with death is hugely significant for how we do reality. In some ways, and I'm sure anthropologists would agree, how a group deals with death defines that group in precise and poignant ways. All of that to say, how do you frame death? Does it put a shudder down your spine? Is it so detestable that you prefer to block it from your mind? Does death finally have the last word, or is death a mere passageway? Well, we saw in our last episode that the Old Testament Hebrews tried to deal with death by focusing enormously loading up on the significance of this life. Everyone's going to go to the pit, but how did one live one's life? That was the important question. That was the Old Testament Hebrew frame. But an enormous shift occurred after the Babylonian captivity back in the 6th century BC, and today I want to delineate that for you. So we're going to talk today about death in the intertestamental period. The intertestamental period class was roughly a 400-year period after the writing of the prophets. So we're talking about the end of the Old Testament writings and the birth of Christ. That period is a time span that variously incorporates the rise of Jewish synagogues and a concomitant shift toward Jewish law. So they moved from a distinct identity solely oriented around Jewish Jerusalem temple worship and began to have more localized worship in their synagogues. Not that the temple ended yet, or what temple worship was over with. Secondly, the intertestamental period was the era during which the Old Testament was translated into Greek into what became known as the Septuagint. Sometime if you're doing reading, you'll see that denoted by the letters LXX, which is Latin for the number 70, and that 70 is for the supposed number of rabbis who were engaged in the translation. By the way, the Septuagint was the Bible that the earliest Christians themselves were reading. Thirdly, the intertestamental period was the time wherein Greek and Aramaic became commonly spoken by the Jews. It was also involved the 100-year-ish span of the Hasmonean dynasty. Say Hasmonean, class. Hasmonean, teacher. Sometimes the Hasmonean Empire was known as the Maccabean, not Mac and Bean, but the Maccabean dynasty. It was a Jewish oligarchy that had defeated the Seleucid army. And then finally, for today anyway, the intertestamental period was the era during which the festival of Hanukkah was originated, and that occurred to celebrate God's miraculous involvement in helping the Jews rededicate the temple following their defeat of the Seleucids. Say Seleucids, class. Seleucids, teacher. Hanukkah is that 8-day-long Jewish holiday that sometimes overlaps with the Christian season of Advent or Christmas. Now, sometimes the intertestamental period is referred to as the silent age, the age during which the Spirit of God was not inspiring people to write books of the Bible. I'm going to argue in this episode that God's Spirit was nevertheless at work, drawing people toward the truth. Sorry, it's so early in the show to go on a rabbit trail, but I'm always amazed by Christians who will talk about the huge segments of history as being void of the presence of God. It's especially weird to me to hear Christians who believe God was inactive. Apparently, he was only waiting until their version of Christianity, their denomination finally followed Christ. And then they'll say, okay, now we know that God was back at work again. Ugh. It's so myopic. That's so narrow. And that's the ugly face of chronological snobbery showing up again, isn't it? Millions of non-religious folks do this, as I noted in my Faith and Reason series, but apparently human beings were just arrogant by nature. Because chronological snobbery is so prevalent, so ubiquitous. Folks, it's not all about your tribe. For griefness' sake. Breathe, Ed, breathe. Just breathe. All right, end of rabbit trail. The intertestamental period was characterized by a variety when it came to their thinking about death and the afterlife. Some Jews in this period began to embrace the doctrine of the resurrection. Others began to believe in the immortality of the soul. Those are a couple beliefs mostly absent through the majority of the Old Testament, as I noted in my last episode. There just was no uniform position on death or the afterlife during the intertestamental period. Some scholars think the Jews took the idea of resurrection from the Egyptian cult of Osiris, where the king died and rose again annually along with the agricultural cycles. But in that cult, the people didn't so much think in terms of human bodily resurrection as they did more so in terms of the ongoing life of their flocks and families, all of which was dependent upon the agricultural cycles. So there's a myth going on there about birth, death, and rebirth that doesn't really approximate resurrection. Still, other scholars have argued that the notion of resurrection came from Persian Zoroastrianism. Say Zoroastrianism, class. Zoroastrianism, teacher. But that idea is widely disputed. Even the book of Daniel, which is obviously aware of Persian influence, the resurrection is not noted as involving all human beings. If you look in chapter 12, verse 2, it says many will be resurrected. And then, interestingly, the Persian notion of resurrection was understood to be a kind of reconstitution of the body through the union of its elements. But there was no sense of some eschatological transformation that occurred to the body, the likes of which we'll see with Jesus and the New Testament. One of my own professors at seminary, longtime theologian there named Colin Brown, he believes the Jews believed in resurrection before they came into contact with Persia. And he argues that the Jews believed in a living God whom they further believed gave lasting life to those with whom he had relationship. So it's possible that the Persians were influenced by the Hebrews rather than the other way around. So there's great variety, different beliefs going on in this period. Jesus ben Sirach, who lived around 180 years before Christ, he had no conception of life after death, so he was like the Sadducees. He believed we died and then we went to Sheol, a place of darkness, endless sleep, and silence. Ethiopic Enoch taught that the wicked will be slain on the day of judgment, while the righteous Jews, but not other people, the righteous Jews will be resurrected. And then that splinter group at Qumran, the eschatologically oriented splinter group at Qumran, say that fast 3 times, that is the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And those Jews believed in a future life. Sometimes they wrote about it in terms of resurrection, and sometimes they wrote about it in terms of the immortal nature of the human soul. And no, those are not the same thing. The Qumran community believed that the spirits or souls of human beings were eternal and imprisoned within the human body. So I say all of that to say there was quite the variety of expectation among the intertestamental Jews. What about burial in first century Judaism? Let's say a few things about that. I think this is interesting because, again, burial rituals convey important information about people's beliefs and values. Well, the Jews buried bodies in family groups in caves or ground chambers, so that bodies, or really bones, were next to each other. And what would happen is they would take the dead body and place it on some kind of bench, and then after about a year-long deterioration process was complete, the bones would be gathered up and put into another place, whether in the corner of that chamber or in some kind of box inside of the burial chamber. And this taking and gathering of the bones was known as secondary burial. First being when you died, they put you on a bench. Second, into a box or a corner. And over time, the repository, the fancy word for it is ossuary. The ossuary came to hold the bones of a family's ancestors, so that when we come across that Old Testament phrase, to be gathered to one's fathers, we find in 2 Kings 22, for example, to be gathered to one's fathers means to be placed in the dead together. And it vividly captures the way that ancient Israel's practiced secondary burial. They wanted to be next to each other, even if that only meant their bones were next to one another. And all of that extended clear back. That kind of practice was going on during the Bronze period, some 1500, 2000 years before Christ. Another way that the Jews practiced burial was that which was influenced by Hellenism, and Hellenism just means Greek culture. And in this practice, the Jews would simply carve niches into their tombs and place the bodies inside of that. If you've ever gone to Rome, if you've ever gone to Italy, you can see that kind of burial practice in the catacombs outside of Rome. Just little carved niche after niche after niche for miles and miles of tunneling there. And then during the Roman period, which begins about 60 years before Christ in Palestine anyway, during the Roman period, the Jews began to use stone sarcophagi. Say sarcophagi, class. Sarcophagi, teacher. Sarcophagi were containers carved from single blocks of limestone, or sometimes they'd make them out of wooden coffins, and they would put the bones inside those boxes, inside those containers. One of the interesting things is that the Jews believed that human corpses were impure, so that contact with one could leave you ritually unclean. We find this in Numbers 19, and we also see it in Matthew 23 and Luke 10. So what that meant is that tombs were generally located outside of towns and cities. That practice has very much been the case across Western civilization, right? The cemetery, if it's not right next to a church, it's put outside. And the Jewish tombs outside the city, the Jewish tombs were whitewashed. And they did that so the people wouldn't become defiled by inappropriate contact with the dead, with dead bodies, with bones. And people could see those cemeteries from a distance because they were whitewashed, and then avoid them. And it's interesting, the Jews were rather different than other cultures on this. They placed the dead away. They removed themselves or removed the dead from themselves. They didn't venerate their ancestors. The dead had no role in everyday Jewish life the way that the dead could have in their surrounding cultures. It was common that the Jews would bury their dead promptly after death, often on the very day of death, and the body would be prepared for burial by closing the eyes, washing it with perfumes and ointments. We see the woman do that at Simon the leper's house in the Gospels to Jesus. She anoints him with that precious perfume. And then they would stop up the bodily orifices with strips of cloth, and then they would wrap the clothing around the body so that the jaw was bound closed, the feet were together, and the hands were to the sides of the body. We even see that in John 11:44 with Lazarus. Eulogies were spoken at a funeral, and sometimes personal effects were placed inside the tomb. As I think about it, would I want my golfing driver buried with me? I don't know. I might want that there next to me for the first thing after the resurrection, a round of golf. And then following a relative's death, the family would undergo mourning, and that would last for 7 days, and where the family would stay at home and receive condolences. That was the strict, severe mourning. And then they would have a 30-day period of less acute mourning, and during that period, the family wouldn't leave their hometown. So there were all kinds of traditions and practices and rituals that involved the dead when it came to ancient Judaism. And the way they took care of bodies makes evident a rather profound respect for the human body. It's something that comes out of Judaism and through Christianity, and I think it's a value that held through Western society right until the end of the 20th century. I think we have a shift going on now. I won't get into the philosophic, theological, pastoral angles of that, but we have a big shift going on right now with our treatment of human bodies. And then finally, regarding burial, the ancient Jews were not burying their dead loved ones with the hope of resurrection. The ancient Christians did that. They were waiting for the soon coming of Jesus Christ and his resurrection, and they would place bones inside tombs and crypts and niches because they wanted there to be something there so that Jesus would have something to work with at the resurrection. Right? If there weren't any bones, what's he going to resurrect? In fact, I just got that question from a listener through Facebook who said, what if there's no body? Essentially, that was the question, and my answer was, well, God can recreate through resurrection what he created the first time in dust. So God's not going to be handicapped by the absence of any bones. Shout out time. Samuel H., thank you. Thanks for that Facebook share, and thank you very much for your generous offer. That was really nice of you. You're very kind, and thank you so much for your feedback and your support. You guys, I would love to purchase a second microphone and a set of headphones to make doing interviews easier. The one I did with Dr. McNutt and the one I did with Dr. Ostring were just a little bit uncomfortable. We had our faces right next to each other, and, well, they both had coffee breath. So, would you consider a one-time donation through Patreon to help me make that possible? Also, I want you to know I just posted an exclusive podcast on death and our hope, coinciding with this series on the afterlife, but I get into that from a little more personal level. I know you know this, but for $5 or more per month, you get access to those exclusive podcasts if you're a Patreon subscriber. Oh, and I have some sweet UU bumper stickers available if you'd like one. Contact me at uncensoredunprofessor@gmail.com. One last businessy thing. If you're new to the UU, if you've only been listening to me for the last month or so, would you contact me at my email on uncensoredunprofessor@gmail.com? Would you contact me and tell me how you heard about the show? That would be very informative for me. All right, back to work. With the intertestamental period, we are watching an enormous shift go on with the ancient Jews, because the Old Testament didn't emphasize punishment in the afterlife or reward in the afterlife, but the New Testament does. The Old Testament didn't emphasize resurrection, it hardly even mentions it. The New Testament takes it as a given. So why was there this enormous change? Well, we said before, some scholars believe that the Persian religions of Parsism and Zoroastrianism influenced to some extent the formation of exilic Judaism, the Jews in exile. Those Iranian religions believed in one supreme God and an end-time renewal of the world, or reconstitution of the world, and a resurrection of the dead, a reconstitution of dead bodies. Zoroaster taught that the afterlife consists of eternal bliss for the good, or eternal woe for the evil. He taught that when one dies, one crosses a bridge into the afterlife, and the bridge is wide or narrow, even narrow to the width of a razor-sharp sword tip. All of that depending on the ethical character of one's life. And he said, if one slips on the sword as one enters death, if one slips on the sword and falls, one enters into the flames of hell. So precarious was our eternal destiny. And I just wonder, was Jesus aware of that historic tidbit when he warned people that the way of life is narrow and the way of death is broad? I'm always fascinated to think and ask how much Jesus was aware of prior religious teaching, other philosophers in his day. So one theory why this change occurred was, again, contact with the Persian religions. But there's another possibility, and I think this second one makes more sense than direct Iranian influence, again, especially given that the Jews believed God was the God of the living. Scholar Gregory Boyd, I believe he's also a pastor in Minnesota, he wrote, the Jewish worldview underwent a significant transformation during the period between the Old and New Testaments. Since the time of the Exodus, the Jews had closely associated the truthfulness of their belief in Yahweh's supremacy with their political successes. Yahweh's lordship over Israel and the world was, for them, most clearly evidenced by the fact that they had won and persevered and gained independent status as a nation. When they were taken into captivity and oppressed by heathen kings, therefore, this caused a crisis of faith for them. It seemed to imply that Yahweh was not, in fact, the sovereign Lord over the earth. Still, so long as there was hope that Israel would someday regain its independence, Israel's national misfortunes could be explained as being the result of their own temporary infidelity to Yahweh. Their misfortunes were not, therefore, an indictment of their belief in Yahweh's supremacy so much as they were an indictment of themselves. And the people believed that as soon as they as a nation repented of their sin and turned back to the Lord would prove faithful and give them back the promised land. End quote of Boyd there. I've read stuff by contemporary Messianic Jews that asserts the same. Once all of Israel finally repents, God will bless them with their Messiah and give them back governorship of the world. Back to Boyd for a minute. Quote, after several hundred years of painful oppression under pagan authorities, however, this chastisement theology began to wear thin. When this oppression turned to overt bloody persecution under Antiochus IV, many Jews abandoned this theology, and an increasing number of Jews in the 3rd and 2nd centuries began to believe that what was happening to them could not be all their fault. It could not be all Yahweh's disciplining will, and they instead began to believe in the power of evil spirits, angels and demons that could affect life on earth. End quote. If you're still listening, thanks so much. My having read that, I need a quick slurp of coffee. Little Sumatra here in the afternoon. So, on this second theory, again the first being Persian influence, on this second theory, what seems to have occurred is an enormous shift away from the hope of a collective, on earth, in time redemption of the exiled Jews as a nation, to one where a more individualized, more personalized view of redemption in the afterlife was embraced. Were there huge numbers of Jews who were giving up on a nationalistic redemption? Were they thrown into a state of existential distress by the ongoing Babylonian captivity, such that they moved to a more personalized belief? Did they think to themselves, hey, I wasn't alive at the time our huge tribe was hauled off into captivity by the Babylonians? No. Hey, I love the Lord. Hey, I'm trying to be faithful to our ways, so why isn't God delivering us? Oh, maybe the Lord has shifted how he's dealing with people. Maybe he wants me to follow him regardless of whether the entire nation is doing that. That all represents an enormous shift in worldview, in expectation, in imagination for their hopes regarding God. Maybe it just made logical sense to shift from macrocosmic hopes for the whole nation to microcosmic hopes for redemption, that in the end God will resurrect individual persons and selves and stop placing all their hopes in such politicized ways. Well, if you read the New Testament, you obviously know that those politicized hopes were still around when Jesus came on the scene. Jews had huge hopes that a political Messiah would arise and deliver them from the hated Romans. And in fact, several political pretender messiahs were arrested and crucified even before Jesus' day, so that poetic understanding of resurrection, right? Resurrection as a national victory. That poetic understanding of resurrection, it didn't go away. Lots of Jews still wanted Israel to be number one, the acme, the zenith of all the people on the earth. That was still there when Jesus came on the scene. But the point of this second perspective is maybe it looks like a newer hope had arisen. Jesus himself obviously believed that personal resurrection was the answer, the truth. Well, is that how it exactly happened in history? Scholars don't know for certain, but the emotional logic of that shift, it makes a great deal of sense to me. Myself, I went through a situation where a whole entire collective community was being brutalized and beaten down year after year. In light of that beatdown, people were praying together, seeking the Lord together, wondering together if God's renewal and restoration and redemption were going to come for the whole community. And me, having prayed and hoped and ached for that collective redemption, and all of that without resolution, I finally had to ask, okay, Lord, you're clearly not moving on behalf of the whole community. You seem to have taken your blessing off of the community. So what do you have for me? Unable to process the cumulative effect of the distress and woe that I was hearing and watching around me, I turned inward and said, well then, if God's not going to rescue the community, even when the community is turning to him in repentance and prayer, then what does he have for me? And I wonder if that's just a little bit similar to what the intertestamental Jews did with their own expectations and hopes for redemption. Maybe they shifted from that collective, nationalistic, politicized hope to a more personalized one, resurrection in the afterlife. And of course, all of that begs the simple question, were they right? Were all those intertestamental Jews correct in believing that God would redeem his own people on a great day of resurrection? Were they right? Well, we have one answer. Jesus sure thought so. He taught repeatedly, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, that the resurrection was coming. And I find it fascinating. And I understand how they could give up on that collective hope and turn toward a more personalized hope for resurrection. Whew! That's some thick historical philosophical plowing, my good listener. And it's going to get thicker in a few minutes in what follows. So let's take a quick ADD break. Yesterday I attended a Boise Hawks minor league baseball game. They are a single-A farm club for the Colorado Rockies, a team located both in Denver and in the National League, which is a league I pay almost zero attention to, a league that is known by those of us who root for the American League as the AAA division of the MLB. All of that aside, Boise Hawks baseball was pretty exciting. Randy went and got tickets for himself and Garrett and me, and he got good seats for us. They were only $13 a piece. And I got to see 3 jacks, a couple pickoffs, a triple, and then they had these pretty goofy entertainment bits. Kids trying to hit tennis balls into a moving truck, kids running the bases in hot dog costumes. There was a pie eating contest down in front of us. They had a catch the slingshotted ball with a fishing net game. It was pure Americana. Yes, I'll admit, being 15 minutes from the big A and probably the greatest player to circle the diamond, Mike Trout. I miss that, but I also love living in a minor league baseball city, too. There's a little ADD for you. Let's think again together, and let's be intellectually honest. If we agree with Boyd that the intertestamental Jews were right to begin believing in a personal, not national resurrection, a personal resurrection of the body, doesn't that raise the issue of God's communication? In other words, were those Jews merely guessing correctly about a bodily resurrection at the end of history, or were they hearing the voice of God? Now, I happen to believe that we human beings are wired for the transcendent. I believe we are wired for the supernatural. I believe we're wired for relationship with God. We're far more as beings than what a post-enlightenment scientific, cold, soulless, economic view of humanity would have us believe. No, we are from birth, out of our very created nature, built for contact with the living God. So it's possible that those intertestamental Jews simply intuited, through their God-created nature, intuited the hope of resurrection. But me? I don't think so. I think the notion of a bodily resurrection is so novel, so unique across all of the human religions, because no other religion in human history looks for a renewed bodily resurrection in the way the Judeo-Christian tradition does. In fact, most religions positively seek the end of the body or an escape from bodily existence. So I don't think those intertestamental Jews were merely intuitively guessing things. I believe the Spirit of God was speaking to those folks about the plan God has for His own people, the people of His name. And if God's Spirit did communicate like that, then we have to posit together the doctrine of progressive revelation. Progressive revelation means that God spoke incrementally about His purpose and work and plan across the centuries. He didn't reveal it all at once. Even though in Genesis 3:15 He reveals something of that plan to Satan, "You shall bruise his heel, but he shall crush your head." God hardly revealed a fully orbed picture all at once. The Old Testament Jews, the ones who followed messianic prophecies anyway, they knew something or someone was coming to set them totally free, but they could hardly have known, and in fact they did not know, that it would be God's Son Himself. They were looking for a human Messiah, empowered by God, but not God's Son per se. So what this means is that God revealed bits and pieces along the way, clear up until He made the final revelation, Jesus Christ incarnate. Now, hereafter, there can be no further revelation. There is no revelation about God that would surpass the perfect icon. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:4 and Colossians 1:15 that Jesus is the exact print of the Father's nature. He's the image of the Father. Nothing can surpass that. To posit an additional revelation, just like the Church of Latter-day Saints does, to posit an additional revelation would be to suggest that God's revelation in Christ was insufficient, that it was not enough, that it lacked power to put us into saving relationship with the Father. No, Jesus is the radiance of the Father, Hebrews 1:3, God's final word to the human race. In any event, following wads of other scholars do believe in progressive revelation. God didn't reveal everything all at once. He didn't spill the beans all at once. He did things incrementally. For reasons that we cannot know, God took his time to convey the full truth about his plan of salvation. And I know that begs still other knotty questions. But progressive revelation makes the most sense of God's work in history. And if you have questions along those lines, email me at uncensoredunprofessor@gmail.com. I really want to weave your questions into future episodes. Next episode, I'm going to talk about what did Jesus do and teach with regard to death and the afterlife. But for today, hey, it was nice to spend some quality time with you. But please, next time, don't sit so close. I don't think our relationship has moved along that far yet. Oh, turn your brains on, everybody.